I was nervous about the meeting. I was unsure of how to answer the question. My neocortex overloaded and my lizard brain took over, and the result was a stupid remark and a broken relationship. Well, take a look at this diagram. It will look very familiar by now. Edwin Friedman itemizes 5 characteristics of anxiety that can lead to conflict. We've discussed the first characteristic, reactivity. This is the set of automated responses that bypass concrete thinking, and they make worse the anxious atmosphere. The opposite of reactivity is that deep breath of self-conscious reflection. It's the moment, or maybe the several moments, when I stop myself and ask, what's really going on here? And more important, what's really going on with me? Reactivity is what the lizard brain does best. Reactivity is the most common response when conflict has reached level 5. Now, another characteristic of anxiety is herding. Forces of togetherness triumph over the forces of individuality. Everyone then adapts to the least mature members in their group. It's a useful behavior if you're a group of musk oxen protecting your young from Arctic wolves. But it's destructive behavior in a congregational conflict. Herding leads to a least common denominator kind of behavior. It doesn't produce creative responses that would do the most good. And the opposite of herding is self-definition. We'll discuss this more in a few minutes, but herding behavior is typical of conflict level number 4. Now, yet another anxious behavior, according to Friedman, is blame displacement. Friedman defines this as an emotional state in which a member focuses on forces that have victimized them rather than taking personal responsibility for their own being and destiny. The opposite of blame displacement is taking responsibility for oneself, one's own ideas, and one's actions. How I feel, how I think, and how I behave are my responsibility, not anyone else's. This behavior of blame displacement is one of the marks of a level 3 conflict. Now, Friedman also describes a quick fix mentality. This mentality focuses on symptom relief rather than systemic change. The opposite of a quick fix mentality is a commitment to understand what's happening in the system without taking things personally. When we move from problem solving to deeper disagreements, we begin to focus on making the problem go away rather than solving it. That's a quick fix mentality, and that's a characteristic, an anxious characteristic of a level 2 conflict. Anxiety, Edwin Friedman notes, can be compared to the volatile atmosphere of a gas-filled room where any sparking incident could set off a conflagration, and where people would then blame the person who struck the match, rather than having tried to disperse the fumes. Does your congregation resemble that description? Well, to review, let's look at our diagram again. As we move to the right on our diagram, our thinking level becomes more emotionally mature. Our behaviors become more intentional and less reactive. Our focus is less and less on personal survival and more on the mission of Christ. Notice that differentiated leadership is the highest level of functioning in a human emotional system. Differentiated leadership is a characteristic of having the mind of Christ that we've been discussing since our first session. Friedman defines a lack of well-differentiated leadership as a failure of nerve that stems both from and contributes to the first four characteristics. Those characteristics of reactivity, herding, blame displacement, and quick fix mentality. Well, leaders in chronically anxious systems spend all their time and energy taking the emotional temperature of the system, and then they try to respond accordingly. Such leaders focus exclusively on keeping everyone happy, and so they tend to burn out quickly, or they become conflictors themselves. Well, let's take another trip down memory lane into my first congregational call. Two members had a rather personal and yet public and nasty disagreement. I had no idea how to help resolve the disagreement. I was sure, however, that somehow I was responsible in some way. After all, I was the pastor. I was responsible for everything that happened in the church, wasn't I? Well, I hope you laughed at my youthful and anxious arrogance. It's amusing now, but let me tell you, it wasn't then. I took it upon myself to settle the fight. Now that was the first mistake, and then I tried to do it in the worst possible way. I wrote a newsletter article. Shall we count up all the conflict resolution mistakes I made by adopting that behavior? I didn't communicate face-to-face. I didn't focus on the mission of the church. I didn't keep myself differentiated from the conflict. I created an emotional triangle. I think I set the record for getting things wrong. I wrote an article blasting the entire congregation for being a difficult place where people didn't get along. And even after the article went out, there was still the potential for recovery because those folks were so gracious. The congregational president came to me with great care and respect, and he said, Are you sure, Pastor, that you mean what you said? Well, my spine stiffened up, and I said every blessed word. Well, I'm sorry to hear that, Pastor, the president replied. 2 weeks later, I was in front of a congregational meeting confessing my foolishness and poor judgment, and after I did that, they asked me to step out of the room for a moment. I began composing my resignation letter in my head and figuring out how I was going to explain this to the bishop. Then they invited me back into the meeting, and Pastor, they said, we forgive you. You're as human as the rest of us, and we know that, but we want you to understand what you did. And then they told me. They said you blamed someone else for your own fears, and you didn't trust us enough to speak directly to us, and you acted as if all our faults were your fault. Please don't do any of that again. They were very wise people.